This is a cool old Japanese guitar that my friend bought, and the frets on it are very low, which makes it a little bit uncomfortable to play. So I'm going to be taking out the frets and refretting it. It also has this rosewood bridge, which I don't think is original. There are holes for some sort of tune-o-matic bridge, and he's given me a roller bridge, which has little rollers on it that should help the tremolo system stay in tune a bit better. So I'm hopefully going to replace that as well. Over the course of a guitar's life, the strings will wear down the metal frets, and that causes flat spots and tuning issues, and a good solution to that would be to re-level all the frets with files and sandpaper and re-crown them. It looks like that has happened a few times on this guitar, and the frets have been worn down quite a bit. So they're currently about 0.6 of a millimeter high, which is very low, and it just makes the guitar uncomfortable to play. So I'm going to replace all the frets. This guitar has a bolt-on neck, so I'm going to remove that as it'll make the whole process a bit easier. So this is a tool you'll probably see me use a lot. It's a little radius block made by Stuart McDonald, and it has a radius carved into it that is the same as the radius of this fretboard. Fretboards aren't flat, they've got a radius on them, which makes it a bit more comfortable to play. But I'm going to use this right now just to gently tap the nut off. You don't want to hit it too hard. There we go. Just enough to break the glue that's holding it on. So I have the neck in a vise, and I'm heating up the fret with a soldering iron, and hopefully if there's any sort of glue holding it in place, it's just going to make it easier to pull the fret out. I have fret pulling pliers. These are just end cutters that have been ground to a point, and just going to try and carefully get them underneath the fret and start lifting it up. Then I can slide this chip stopper underneath, which is a very thin piece of metal with a slot cut into it, and hopefully that'll stop the rosewood fretboard from chipping out when I pull the barbed tang from its slot. So you can see there you've got the barbed tang that sits in that fret slot, and I've avoided any chip out, which is good. So I've got all the frets out now, and I managed to avoid any major chip out, but I'm just going to clean up the fretboard very carefully with some 400 grit sandpaper on my radius block. So this fretboard marker, you can see there's a little bit of a crack there where it's obviously shrunk a little bit, as they tend to do with age. And it's also lifting up a tiny bit, so I'm just going to wick some thin super glue into that crack. Just clean up any excess. And then carefully clamp it. After cleaning up with 600 grit, it's barely noticeable at all, and the inlay sits nice and flush with the fretboard, and now the fretboard is all nice and clean and ready to be refretted. So this is the new fret wire. It comes in straight lengths from the factory, and you can see the barbed tang and then the fret top. And the first thing that I'm going to do is to clean this with acetone, just to remove any sorts of oils or grease from the factory. So this is my fret wire bending jig. It's a wheel with a handle, and that wheel has a slot in it for the tang of the fret wire to go into. And then I have two skateboard bearings either side, and this one is adjustable up and down so that I can adjust the radius of the fret wire, and then I set that to match the radius of the neck that I am refretting. So I've got the fret wire radiused. It's actually slightly over radiused, and now I'm going to cut it to size. So I'm just going to use the fretboard as my guide and take my fret cutters. So these are specifically fret wire cutters. I've actually written frets only on there in case anyone gets the wrong idea, because they're not cheap. They're ground flush to the cutting edge. That way if you're cutting frets after installing them, you can cut them right up close to the edge of the fretboard. And now, because this is a bound neck, so it's got that white binding on the edge, you can see the slot doesn't go all the way through. So it has a start and end point. So if I tried to install it right now, it wouldn't work because the tang would want to go right over where it doesn't have a slot. So it's a new tool that I bought recently. This is a fret wire tang clipper. So you can just put the fret wire in here and clip off the tang. Still has a tiny ridge there, so I'll file that off just to make it neat. So you can see after cutting that, the tang will fit down into that slot, and then it has a nice little overhang, so you get the full width of the fret wire on the fingerboard. The fret tang is just slightly shorter than the slot, and that's to stop the tang poking out of the binding with seasonal expansion and contraction. And the fret is also slightly over radiused for the fingerboard. And that's so I can just tap it into place on the two sides. And then I can take it to my fret press. So this is a basic metalworking arbor press, and it has a special little tool in the jaws which holds these brass fret clamping cauls. And so they're all different types of radiuses for different radius fretboards, and it clamps the frets into place rather than hammering them, which gives you a much more even pressure, and you can make sure the fret is perfectly seated every time. So I have the neck in this little caul, and I will line up the fret wire with my fret press, and then gently press it in. I'm just going to use my fret cutters just to make sure that the frets are as close to the edge of the fretboard as they can be. So now I've got the neck in a vise, and I'm just going to use this fret file, which is just a file stuck to a piece of wood, to carefully file down the ends of the frets. So now I've got the fret ends flush with the edge of the fingerboard. I can use this fret beveling file, which is something I made quite a few years ago. It's just a file that I've glued into this block of wood on an angle, and that's going to give me a nice consistent bevel on the edges of the frets, just to make it more comfortable when you run your hands up and down the fretboard. I've got my fingerboard all taped up to protect it from any marks, and I've got this 5-sided straight edge from StewMac. which I'm just going to check all the frets with. So this is quite handy because you can get it to seat on 3 frets at a time, and as you get up the fingerboard and the frets get closer together, you can use the different surfaces to make sure that you're only contacting 3 frets at a time. And then you can kind of find any areas where a fret might be seated slightly high. So just here I can feel it wobbling a little bit, and I know that that fret is a little bit high. But I've gone through and checked that all the frets are pressed in as well as they can be. So now I'm going to mark up the tops with some permanent marker, and then just take off the top and make sure that they're all level. So I'm going to use my radius block again to match the radius of the frets, and some 240 grit sandpaper. Some people like to start with a fret file, but I really don't think it's necessary for these frets. They're not that bad, so it should only take me a few swipes with the sandpaper to take them all level. And that way I can avoid getting any deep scratches in the frets. So thanks to the black marker, I can see a few spots where I still need to take the frets down a little bit further. Just here, this fret is obviously seating a little bit lower than the 2 frets either side of it. So I'm just going to focus my attention on those areas. So now I've got rid of all of the black spots, I'm just going to double check everything. Yeah, so with just 2 swipes I can see that we're pretty much perfect all up and down the fingerboard. Now I'm going to triple check it with the 5-sided straight edge. So seat it on 3 frets and check for any sort of play. So now that all the frets are nice and flat, they have a very slight flat spot on the top of the frets, and a flat spot on the top of the fret can cause sustain issues and intonation issues. So I need to reprofile them round. And to do that I have this fret profiling file, and it has a little concave file in the shape of the fret. This one is for medium or wide fret wire. So I'm just going to use that to reprofile the tops of the frets. And I've marked them up again, so hopefully with a few swipes I can see a nice black line across the top of the fret. I can start the slightly laborious task of polishing all the frets. I'm going to use 400 grit sandpaper to begin with, and then move up through 600, 800 and 1000. Before I go through my final polishing, I've got this miniature file which has a nice safe edge on one side and a rounded edge on the other side. I'm just going to get into these sharp corners on these frets and just give them a couple of swipes, try and round them over so that when you run your hand across the fretboard it feels nice and smooth. Frets are all level, crowned and polished, and now I'm going to give the fretboard a nice coat of linseed oil. So I've got the neck attached to the body, and my friend wants me to install this roller bridge. It has holes in the body for a Tune-o-matic style bridge, but it actually came strung up with this floating ebony bridge. And I assume the reason for that is because these holes are drilled in the wrong position. I measured them and then I have checked again by shimming up the bridge and just floating it on the body, and I've kind of positioned it where it intonates best with the rollers in the center of their travel. And the holes do not align. They're about 5 to 10 millimeters out of alignment, and these rollers would not move forwards or back enough to allow the bridge to intonate while sitting on posts in these holes. So I think I'm going to have to fill the holes and then re-drill for new posts. So I've got the plugs pared down, and I've just mixed up some water-based stain. Hopefully that's going to be a pretty good match. I've got the roller bridge in place exactly where I want it. It's intonating on both the E-strings with the saddle set in the center of the bridge, and I've checked to make sure that the E-strings are nice and aligned with the sides of the neck. So now I'm going to mark the points for drilling it with this brad point drill bit. With the rounded back on these guitars, it's really hard to drill the hole parallel. So I've got a little bit of padding underneath, and I'm just going to do my best. So I've got the bridge installed now and given it a full setup, and it all plays in tune now. I probably could have even brought it a little bit further forward. As you can see, the E's almost at the full extent of its travel there. But the pickup is so far back, I didn't really want to bring it any further forward. So fortunately it plays in tune, and that's all that matters. And now it's ready to go back to its home. This is my new favourite tool. I bought it from Stuart McDonald, and it is a guitar jack gripper. So basically it fits into your guitar jack, and then with one twist it locks it in place so that you can tighten or loosen the nut. It's such a great tool, and it comes with a couple of sockets that you can slot over the tool, grip the jack in place, and then you can give them a little tighten. It's a job that I have to do all the time on guitars, and on a guitar like this it can be especially tricky when there's no way to hold the jack in place while you tighten the nut. So this is an excellent tool. A little bit expensive, but I think it's worth every penny.